Welcome this morning. Thank you everyone for taking the time to get on an early call to engage in the Waste No More public input process. On this morning's meeting, we have event permit holders, task force members, ballot sponsors, and different city agencies, including the Office of Special Events, representatives from the Climate Action Office, Parks and Recreation, and Erica Rogers from Excise and License will be facilitating the discussion portion of today's focus group. She has been a participant in the task force and also in the licensee discussions. So real quick, the agenda, we are here specifically to talk about permitted events. Oh no. Can anyone else hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you, Rose. Yeah.
Good.
Yep.
Thank you for confirming. So we will go over a quick overview and origin of the ordinance that we're here to talk about. We will talk about the task force, what it is and what they are doing. We will briefly touch on the overall recommendations from the task force on the ordinance, but specifically we are going to focus on discussing the permitted event section of the ordinance. So the Waste No More ordinance was passed by 70% of voters in the fall of 22. It is a citizen-sponsored ballot initiative and requires 3-stream waste diversion of many different sectors all throughout Denver. So it will be required of all residential and non-residential buildings, food waste producers, venues, permitted events, construction, demolition. Generally, all of Denver will be required by this ordinance to have 3-stream waste diversion. So the permitted events section of this ordinance is section 48-138. What do we mean by permitted events? That means events that are outdoors on public property, which means streets, sidewalks, alleyways, Denver parks. And it does not include events that are not permitted. So event spaces, venues, stadiums, indoor events, conference centers, etc. All of those type of events are covered under a different section of the ordinance. If you are curious about those specifics, that is covered under non-residential and food waste producers, which is section 48-132. So what does this ordinance require of permitted events? It requires 3-stream waste containers to be placed at all of your events. That includes compost, recycling, and landfill. It has signage requirements. A waste management plan is required to be submitted with your event permit application, and training for event staff and volunteers. I do hope that all of you have had a chance to take a look at the ordinance verbiage. I have it right here. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but did quickly highlight all of the specifics of what it requires of events, what we just talked about. So the 3-stream containers, appropriate signage, waste management plan, and volunteer training. It is a small section of ordinance, so please familiarize yourself if you haven't already. So what is not required of permitted events in this ordinance? This ordinance does not talk about contamination enforcement, staff for sorting, or diversion metrics. So just know that as we move into our discussion portion of today's focus group, that that is not part of this ordinance. So we will just specifically be talking about the pieces included. Does anybody have questions about the ordinance before we talk about the task force? No, no hands? Okay, very good. So what is a task force and what does it do? The purpose of the task force is to assist in implementing the ordinance, clarifying the requirements, and oversee the draft recommendations that we're sending to City Council. The ballot language as written was not fully enforceable. It was written for the 2021 ballot and made it onto the 2022 ballot. So one of the key things we are trying to do is right size the compliance dates as they're currently backdated. Some examples of where task force have been used for successful implementation of other ordinances include the Green Building Ordinance, which was another citizen-sponsored ballot initiative, the Climate Action Task Force, Energize Denver, and a task force that was created for accessory dwelling units. So the task force participants consist of public stakeholders from all of the regulated entities, stakeholders that are indirectly or directly impacted, the ballot sponsors, and members of city council. It's been supported by city staff of the agencies that are in charge of enforcing this ordinance, and also supported by a facilitator in the discussions. So there are 2 seats out of the 26 seats dedicated to permitted events, and our representatives there are Andrea Furness and Renee Ortiz. The timeline and process for the task force: this February, we opened the application for the 26 different members, and they started to meet between March and July for monthly meetings. There were working group sessions in between the meetings for various different topics. And now we are at the public engagement portion of the task force timeline. We will be having many different meetings, engaging public input, and then taking that input back to the task force to revise any recommendations and finalize the report that's going to City Council. We do intend to send the report and recommendations to City Council this fall so that we can work on drafting revisions and rules and regulations. Does anyone have questions on the task force before we move on to the recommendations? Okay. So here are some current recommendations for the task force as a whole. I do want to clarify for the group the difference between a supportive recommendation and a recommendation for the ordinance. So most of the recommendations that we are going to talk about today are ordinance recommendations. Those are recommendations that will change the verbiage of the ordinance. It includes adjustments and clarifications. It does not include adding anything new to the ordinance or significantly changing what was voted on. Supportive recommendations are suggestions that are going to be documented and put forth to City Council. However, they do not go into the ordinance. And just for everyone's awareness, all of these recommendations, in order to be passed, must be approved by a supermajority of the council members. So some basic cleanups that are being recommended are definitions. The ordinance as written is currently missing definitions. So we are going to draft definitions for terms that are not already included in the Denver Revised Municipal Code. Another recommendation is around enforcement, and that it should prioritize education and support, follow a graduated scale with warnings and opportunities to comply without penalty, and not result in a loss of license or livelihood, especially if an operator is making a good faith effort to comply. It also includes requirements for signage and education. So I'm not going to read through all of the supportive recommendations, but they largely revolve around education and financial support. So some best practices guidelines, color coding, consistency, things like that are all supportive recommendations that are being put forth. Additionally, grant funding and other programs that will include financial supports. Again, these are supportive recommendations, so they will not go into ordinance, but they will go in front of City Council. So just a quick visual here for the way the ordinance is currently written. It was written again for the 2021 ballot with an implementation timeline starting in 22, which was before it actually made it onto the ballot. The ordinance as written, the timeline for rollout was over the course of 4 years. So now I'm going to show the proposed timeline for rollout based on the recommendations that the task force is putting forth, with the soonest enforcement timeline beginning no later than January 1st of 2025. And again, through essentially a 4-year rollout phase. So all of these recommendations assume that the regulated entities need to comply by January 1st of 2027. Does anyone have questions about the overall recommendations before we move into the permanent events section? Okay. So moving on, we're going to talk about the recommendations specific to ordinance section 48-138. And I'm going to turn it over to Erica Rogers to facilitate the discussion portion.
Thank you so much, Rose, and good morning, everybody. I'm Erica Rogers. I'm the policy director over here in Excise and Licenses, helping out, honored to be helping out with this awesome ordinance to send less stuff to landfills and figure out how to implement it in a really meaningful way. So in this part of the meeting, we're going to focus on an ask from the task force, which is to get public input from a wider group of stakeholders on the permanent events recommendation. So like Rose mentioned, you all have 2 great representatives on the task force who have been advocating for your realities, your special challenges, your points of view, but this is really an opportunity to hear from more of you specifically about the permitted events recommendation. So this discussion is going to mainly focus on some narrow information that the task force is still looking to get some clarity on. There's many pieces of this complex initiative. There's many participants. So today we're going to focus on, for permanent events, 2 questions. And the 2 questions are, who should go first, right? When we're looking at that phasing that Rose was talking about, we have different groups going at different times, but largely, like she said, trying to stay within the parameters of the original language, which was a 4-year rollout. The second question we'll talk about is what constitutes an exemption. So, what types of events should be exempt from the requirements entirely. So we'll talk about each of those in turn. And I'm sure you all know this, but it is morning. I'm still working on my coffee. Some of you may be as well. So let's just remember a refresher about some meeting expectations. Let's focus on the recommendations. That's really where we need your feedback. A couple of things we won't talk about, which is this ordinance has passed by voter referendum. So we're not going to relitigate any of the discussion about whether, you think it should or shouldn't be in effect or anything like that. We're going to focus on how to make it successful. So to do that, obviously, we want to be respectful of anyone's perspectives and experiences. We also want to be solution oriented, right? It's easy to poke holes in why one option won't work, but it's much more helpful to the task force to focus on, here's what I like about this option, or here's what I like about that option. That'll also help when we get to city council. So logistics, if you have questions, you can raise your hand or you can drop them in the chat. I know Megan from OSC is going to be monitoring the chat to try to help people get answers as we're talking. But like I said, if you have questions, you can also raise your hand, or if you have comments when we get to the discussion round. And another thing I wanted to just reiterate to all of you is that the task force is aware that there are unique challenges for permitted events that maybe don't apply for other sectors that the ordinance applies to, right? Each of those arrows on the overall timeline, right, that represents a different group with different requirements of how they're going to comply, right? And they each have their unique challenges. Your task force members have done a really good job reminding the group at large of the unique challenges that permitted events face. Some of these include no recurring hauler contract, varied operational locations, night and weekend operations for pickups, and the need to return to public space quickly. All of these have to do with the fact that a lot of you may not have a permanent brick and mortar the way that some other buildings under the ordinance have. So let's remind or refresh on, who's included in the concept of permitted events in that section that Rose talked about of the ordinance. So this would be events that have the types of permits that are listed here on the screen. So any of the Office of Special Events permits would be considered a permitted event. Events that have specific types of park permits and specific types of street permits. So the Parks Department and Dottie issue all different kinds of permits, but not all of them will qualify, the permit holder as a permitted event. So the park permits that would qualify you as a permitted event would be special occasion permits, public event permits, tournament permits, and assembly permits. The types of street permits that Dottie issues that would qualify an event are the special event revocable street occupancy permits. Say that 5 times fast. So those are the types of permits that we're talking about. Now, who's already not included in the ordinance? So a couple of types of events are not considered permitted events. One of these is block parties. Those block parties don't require a waste hauling plan or service. Residents use their own 3-stream carts. And then picnics that are permitted by Parks and Rec. As I mentioned, only specific parks permits qualify you as a permitted event. But picnics do not. So those, again, do not require a waste hauling plan or service. And any waste removal from a picnic is separate from, the waste receptacles that are already in parks and maintained by parks and run by parks. And another reminder, as Rose mentioned, event venues and spaces wouldn't fall under permitted events, even though they might feel the same. Those fall under either non-residential buildings or food waste producers, which are in different sections of the ordinance, depending on the type of event venue. I think, some good examples are the big ones we all know: Ball Arena, Coors Field, Mission Ballroom, right? Those would be covered under different sections of the ordinance, not this section about permitted events.
Erica, we have a question in the chat. So before we move on to discussion, I want to address that. So Brian Loma asked, can you explain what a waste diversion plan is so that people can understand how that applies and assists in front and back of house setup before we engage in discussion of concerns? So for a waste diversion plan, really the waste management plan requires you to show how your event is going to place the different locations of your 3-stream receptacles. So in every location that you have a waste receptacle, you will have 3-stream waste. So that whether it's your staff in the back of house or your customers in the front of house, anywhere there is a trash location, you will have the option for compost, recycling, and landfill. Additionally, it will require you to have a plan as for how you're going to haul that off-site and how you'll manage it. It does include the requirement for signage so that people know which receptacle is allocated to which diversion space. And I think that covers it, but Brian, you have your hand up, so I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that the waste diversion plan also offers an opportunity for the event planner in this case to look at the sources of the materials that are going to be ending up in the waste stream, to communicate with their vendors, the types of material that they will be required to utilize. So if you have organic diversion set up at the front of the house, then the vendors have an ability to provide certified compostable materials that would qualify to prevent contamination. That a waste plan can help address the multi-stream concerns that might not just be recycle in a single stream recycling. So for example, plastic films, ice bags, the shrink wrap from the cases of canned beverages, things like water bottles, things like that, as well as like where the materials go. But it's also like helping the vendors communicate with with the event holder to make sure that the materials that are being brought to the event allow for the easiest reduction of contamination possible.
Brian, thanks so much for that background on the waste diversion plans. For folks listening and taking in that information, that might be something that plays in when we get to the discussion of the next question. But in the interest of time, I want to move us forward on the first question, which is talking about further exemptions for events that will not need to meet the requirements in ordinance. So we've talked about who is included, the types of permitted events. We've talked about who's not included already. And so let's go to the next slide and we can launch into the first part of our discussion, which is about who should be exempt. And so in the ordinance currently, it pulls out events with de minimis volume of waste. So the task force has recommended that de minimis threshold be set at less than 350 daily total attendees. The reason for that recommendation is because it aligns with existing event permit tiers. And the idea, I think the main idea, and the ballot sponsors are on the call, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the main idea of the ordinance is to reduce as much waste as possible from going to landfills, right? And so in looking at how we can have the biggest impact as soon as possible in the city and county of Denver, this was something that in the language, de minimis volume was left to be defined. So that's one recommendation for exemptions. Another recommendation is that events using reusable serviceware and events that do not serve food would not have to comply with the requirements. And the idea behind these is that these are all events that are not going to be producing a large amount of divertible waste. And so, it's not the focus of the ordinance, not to say that you can't still participate in waste diversion that is sustainable, at smaller events, but they wouldn't be monitored and required under the ordinance at this time. So knowing that, I'm going to open it up for question or for feedback on, thoughts from the group about these exemptions.
Erica, I did just want to clarify that the ordinance states already that events with de minimis volume, events using reusable serviceware, and events that do not serve food would be exempt. So that's something already existing in ordinance. What we're looking for is to clarify, particularly what constitutes as de minimis.
Right, the 350 threshold.
Exactly. So does anyone have any thoughts on this threshold? Essentially, the 350 number came from where event permit tiers already exist, both within parks and the Office of Special Events. Brian, I see your hand is up, but I can't tell if it's still up from before or if it's up again.
Sorry, I did lower it and raise it again. And just for the purpose of the record, my name is Brian Loma. I am one of the sponsors of the measure and proponents. And I am concerned about a couple of things. One, I think that it should be food or beverage service, because when we look at beverage services, those are going to provide a wide variety of easily divertible materials, including plastic bottles and aluminum cans, which is a large quantity of waste. For if there's no food, then there's still those materials in the single stream recyclables. And in the same way that we separate businesses that don't serve food or don't have a large amount of residents where they're not going to be required to have organic diversion, but still have single stream or a waste plan that allows for alternative streams of diversion. I think that's an important aspect for that. And even though like a liquor license might require food, I could still have canned soda and bottled water, and that would be a divertible material. So that I want to offer that opinion.
So you would recommend that events that do not serve food but do serve beverages not be exempt?
Correct. And a event of 350 people or more that doesn't have beverages or food, right? Because if you have 350 people, you're probably going to have beverage service of some kind.
How does the rest of the group feel about that recommendation? If you like it, you can use like a thumbs up react. Maybe we can get an idea, or you can put your thoughts in the chat. See some thumbs up. Okay. Does anyone, okay, so we're including that. Okay, makes sense. That's something we can take back to the task force for sure.
Interesting. So Renee dropped in the chat here that a requirement of the liquor permit is to have food available. So that kind of one begets the other. I'm trying to catch up on all the chat.
Not all of them do. So I think, and just because, and also beverage service could be non-alcoholic as well. So I think it makes sense to treat each of them individually.
Gotcha.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of support. If you have other thoughts, don't be shy. But it sounds like I'm not.
Erica, can we clarify something really quickly? I'm sorry. I see a comment in the chat from Hannah at City Park Jazz, and she says, I'm from City Park Jazz and we don't serve food, but there's still a ton of food waste that happens because of BYOB and food trucks. If your event provides space for vendors to serve or sell food, that would be considered your event serving food, correct?
Yeah.
So,
and we are having a focus group specifically about food trucks, where we'll talk about this as well. So I think it's good that she brought that up.
Thanks for clarifying, Megan.
Yeah. All right, so we're almost halfway through. Does anyone have any thoughts on the number 350? It doesn't sound like we haven't heard any strong feelings one way or another in the chat, but I want to invite anyone who has any different thoughts to speak up. Otherwise, we can move into the next question, which I think will maybe merit a little bit more discussion because there are a few more different options.
Erica, Eric from CCC put in the chat, and I think it's important we discuss the reusable serviceware. What does that include and not include? For example, plates, cups, utensils, napkins. Is there a definition? What percentage of serviceware does it need to be? He's thinking events that use r.Cups can say they're using reusable serviceware, but that would just apply to the beverages. So I think that's important for this group to weigh in on. What does constitute the reusable serviceware exemption? And I did see both Renee's hand up and I see Brian's hand up again. So I'll ask Renee to go first and then.
Yeah, it was just a tiny little piece about that liquor requirement to have food available. That's a state, that's part of the state liquor law of having food available. So just wanted to chime in with that, but otherwise keep going.
Brian and then Randy.
So I want to adjust both of those. I think that the reusables, as intended by the ballot sponsor, was designed to think about sit down dining. So if it was a catered event with plates and forks and glassware, then that single stream recycling front of the house might not be as required for signage and everything. But that's because those events would have that management done in back of the house, where the bus service are sorting their recycling, organic diversion, things like that. As far as the 350, it's always been a concern since I heard that first, because I believe that that's a standard for issuing permits by the city or for special events. But there's a lot of events where there's less than 350 where food or beverage services are being offered, and at minimum encouraging those organizations to follow the same guidelines, to have a plan and to establish diversion so that it doesn't just landfill, is a recommendation that I would like to make.
And that's one of the, as I mentioned, there are many other pieces that, we're not going to be able to cover in our 1 hour together today. But Brian, that's a good point, right? That is another piece of the recommendations, the supportive recommendations, that while maybe not required, there would certainly be plenty of education offered to, folks who are trying to have events that want to know how to do, to implement these types of practices at their event, but it wouldn't be under the ordinance specific requirement. On the reusable serviceware, we can make a note to the task force to maybe update the language for events only, or using only reusable serviceware, so that it's a pretty clear cut. Then it's not a percentage, and it's not something that people are trying to navigate or find a loophole. It would just be, if it is a fully reusable serviceware event, you wouldn't have to follow it. But if you're going to be using any amount of single-use serviceware, you'd have to comply with the ordinance.
One thing really quick, Erica, on that is that if I can see events that would use, reusable plates, reusable silverware, reusable glasses, but have paper napkins, and so there is I think some discussion to be had of that percentage, if you're 90% reusable, 10% disposable. I don't know, does that make it exempt or not? I think is something that maybe we can circle back around on.
I see Randy has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. It's Randy Mormon with EcoCycle. And I just wanted to add to the reusable piece. I do think, we're seeing a lot of new innovative services come around where it's not just sit down, but I think you could have an event that's not sit down where reusables are used. So I would encourage us to really look at that definition and make sure that we are, one, making sure that there's no loopholes like we've been talking about, but also are looking forward into what new innovative practices could be coming online for reusables at large events that aren't necessarily sit down. So I think there is more to be discussed there. I don't know what the exact formula is, but I certainly want us to prevent having any loopholes like we were talking about, where someone just has an r.Cup and then has a bunch of disposable plates, because that should not qualify as a reusable event.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, just something to keep in mind is that, this is, and Blake, thank you, and Office of Special Events had put the ordinance language in the chat, right? And it specifically contemplated requirements that can be waived for in certain cases, but not others. And this is one of the areas generating de minimis volumes of waste that is already considered, we're trying to figure out what is that de minimis, where do we make that threshold now? Now, that's not to say in the future, once we have the ordinance implemented, maybe it's working really well, That's not to say that city council could never lower that number. It's just a starting point for taking this ordinance from, voter approval to implementation and getting things moving. So, that would require additional stakeholder feedback in the future, but I think that it's not something that, can never be readdressed or reconsidered. And it's also something that we can provide education for, so that it's not, none of these events are doing it anyway, that kind of thing. So. All right, with that, I'm gonna, I think, move it forward to a poll, just to get, like I said, a read on kind of how people are feeling. This will help us give some good feedback to the task force. And of course, all of the comments made have been recorded and will be included in that discussion. So you should see a little pop-up poll, and just let us know what you're thinking.
Nice. It looks like we're getting some decent engagement on our poll. Numbers are still coming in, but generally it looks like we have 70% of our participants agree with that threshold and 30% are against. So that does give us a decent sense of where this group is at. Right now we have 37 of 48 participants have weighed in. So thank you everyone for weighing in on this. We really appreciate it.
For the record, Rose, I did not weigh in because I don't think you want my opinion. I'm just the facilitator, so I didn't weigh in.
Oh, yes, exactly. So that's actually a pretty good percentage, given that some of us aren't weighing in on this. So just sharing the results of the poll with everyone real quickly, and then, yeah, allowing for time for us to discuss the next topic. So thank you everyone so much for that, and we will move on.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone. All right. The other big question that the task force is curious for more feedback on is phrased pretty simply, but it's who should go first, right? The current ordinance language has all permitted events complying at the same time. I believe the timeline was June 1st, 2023, if I'm remembering right. But the task force has had some discussion, and there are a couple different options, right? We could do some phasing like the other groups have, right? The other responsible parties under the ordinance. And we could have phasing go from the largest groups first, and then have small groups go later. And by go later, I mean just have a later drop dead compliance date, right? It's kind of like the last date that you would have to comply, but you can comply sooner than that. So looking at having large groups required to comply first, with small coming second. The other option is to have small groups going first and large groups going second. And the third option is to have no phasing, right? Keep all events in the same compliance timeframe, just like the current ordinance language, but just extending that date a little bit to update the ordinance. So these are the kind of four options within those realms. The first two are focusing on the large events first. Option 3 is small events first, and option 4 is no phasing. So I think we're going to run through each one individually. So this is the first option. It's the one that the task force has kind of put forth as a recommendation. This would require that events over 10,000 attendees comply no later than January 1st, 2025. Again, they can start complying next year if they want. It's just in the 2025 event cycle, they would all have to comply. Then following that, events over 3,000 attendees by January 1st, 2026. And then events over 350 complying no later than January 1st, 2027. So some guiding principles behind this recommendation. First and foremost, we're to maintain voter intent and bill drafter intent of having the largest impact first, right? How can we divert the most amount of stuff from the landfill as soon as possible? So having those biggest events go first aligns with that. It, of course, considers those unique challenges of the permanent events versus the other sectors that I mentioned. Those larger events may have more resources than the smaller events from the get-go, right out of the gate. Another leading event or leading principle that the task force considered here was equity, right? Some of those smaller events may struggle to acquire those resources right away, just with smaller budgets or smaller staffs or volunteer forces. So equity was at the forefront here as well. And then, of course, feasibility. So that's kind of the guiding principles behind that first option. So that you can kind of understand how the task force got there. Now, the second option also keeps large events as going first. However, it collapses it into 2 phases rather than 3. And so some of the guiding principles here were, again, to maintain that voter intent of having the largest impact first. That is the same as option 1. There's still the equity piece with the smaller events having a little bit more time to comply, learn from how the larger events are doing it. Maybe there's more services available to them, and maybe it's a little bit more feasible. However, the difference between option 2 and the first option is that this does it faster, right? Instead of having giving the smallest events until January 1st, 2027, it has 2 phases with the second compliance date, January 1st, 2026. So they're very similar, but it just makes those smaller events come into compliance a year earlier. And that would be, again, to meet the goal of having as big of an impact as possible as soon as possible.
Erica, real quick, I just wanted to clarify because I saw a question in the chat. The attendee numbers are daily total attendees, and that's how we do our event permit tiers. So it's not your peak total attendance, it is the entire amount of attendees that attend your event throughout a day. So for example, a farmer's market might only have 50 people at one time, but throughout the day they have 1,000. So it is per day, your daily total attendance.
Thanks, Rose. All right, so we talked about the 2 options that put larger events first. Option 3 swaps that timeline, and it has smaller events going first with compliance by January 1st, 2025, and larger events going second, complying no later than January 1st, 2026. The guiding principle here is that we want to focus on how to do things successfully, and there is a group of folks who have said that it might make sense to have the smaller events go first. We can establish some best practices, and then we can expand a successful model wide scale. So that's the guiding principles there. And then finally, option 4, all events, regardless of size, just have 2 years to come into compliance. They can start sooner, but no later than January 1st, 2026. The guiding principles that were strongest here are the ease of education and the simplicity, right? No one's trying to figure out, where am I on the threshold? What's my timeline? I have to look back and see where I comply. All the education for all the permanent events can be the same. It can be the same message, and it would be straightforward. So each of the options has a little bit different guiding principles. No one is better or more important than the other. I think, right, it's good to keep in mind what the features, the positive features of each option are. And so having gone over them, I think we'll have a slide now that has them all back up so you can look at all of them at once. And I think, I'll invite people to talk about which option do you think you like the best and why, right? And if you can focus on either a guiding principle that we've talked about or identified, or maybe one that wasn't identified that you think is relevant for the task force to know about. We certainly are just trying to summarize a lot of really important stuff. So please feel free to weigh in with something that you think should be the leading guiding principle when we're looking at this particular timeline.
So Andrea Furness dropped in the chat that many of the large events are also produced by nonprofits. So needing to give them time as well to work this in their budgets. Andrea, I assume that you're referring to the fourth option of everyone going at once. Is that correct?
No, my hope is that the small events would go first so that we could learn, see what works well, what doesn't. Those of us that have produced large events know a lot of the hardships, the difficulties with creating a successful plan, and not simply greenwashing. But to really learn and to also give time for those bigger events, specifically the ones produced by nonprofits. It's going to cost money to put something like this into effect, and really wanting to give them time to work this into their budgets. I think one thing that we talked about on the task force is doing this well and being successful, and not, and we will be able to learn a lot, I think, along the way.
Okay, thanks, Andrea, for that. I see a question in the chat on whether January 1st, 2025 was considered for option 4. It was, we talked about different years, yes. I think if we're going to keep everybody on the same timeline, we wanted to have 2 event seasons for education and allowing folks to experiment, right, and see what works and see what is successful. Those were some of the considerations that I remember being talked about. There may be others in that question.
Erica, in the task force meeting where we discussed this, there was a lot of back and forth on who should go first, because events were wanting time to build this into their budgets. At least for our office, something like 80% of events are produced by nonprofits, so that is most of them. So I think that is why that recommendation was thrown out there, was to give both tiers of events an equal amount of time to prepare and educate and come into compliance. Not to say that we wouldn't encourage events to comply first. I mean, some events are already doing this, so that's great, but it does allow time for the market to catch up so that there's availability for all events to do this. And so that's why the 26 was part of that proposal. And we have a lot of hands up, Erica, too, so.
Yes, I see. Let's go to Eric. I think your hand was up first.
I just have a quick question. In the desire to have the greatest impact, was it considered the quantity of events at each level? Like for option 1, how many events take place in the city that are 10,000 or greater? How many take place between 3,000 and 10,000? And how many take place that are less than 350? If you're thinking about greatest impact, cumulatively, if there's a way more in the medium or whatever range, will that have the greatest impact? And was that considered in options 2 and 3, instead of only 2 phases, still considered 3 phases, so that, again, it's thinking about what will have the greatest impact when looking at it that way. So that's my question.
Yeah, Eric, actually, we did take into consideration the quantity of each of these events. Now, there's no way, because we're not, at this point, we don't have access to data of the tonnage of each of those events, so we don't know truly which is going to have the greater impact. However, the volume of events was a consideration when talking about this phasing, because right now there is not availability for every single event that we permit to be serviced by what is out there currently available with haulers. So we did consider that when talking about phasing, whether it was small first or large first, so that there would actually be feasibility of a certain number of events to be able to do this in a certain timeline, and then eventually for the market to catch up with what's being required, and then have more availability for events. So we don't know specifically, is the medium-sized events at a higher quantity going to divert more waste, or the large events at a smaller quantity going to divert more waste? We don't know that, but it was part of the consideration in these recommendations.
I think Christy and then Brian are next.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in. I think throughout these several months of going over all of these factors, it seems to me that option 4 is kind of the most straightforward and sort of level playing field approach to take here. You know, one thing that's sort of been touched on that we witness all the time, event size, number of attendees does not necessarily correlate with amount of material produced and able to be diverted. And, you know, given all of the potential complexity in, you know, both from the city side and from event permit holder side and determining where they fall on these different attendee thresholds. And given the fact that option 4 does provide 2 years for everyone to come in compliance, which seems to me a pretty decent amount of time to act on some of these recommendations that we're seeing here, like ways of sharing best practices, the city being having enough time to develop appropriate recommendations and standards for signage and education and things of that nature. Option 4 just seems like the simplest, most straightforward approach.
Thanks, Christy. I think Brian's next.
Yeah, I want to remind people that the big concern in the discussion of the timeline here is capacity for organic diversion. I just excitedly 2 weekends ago participating with the green team at the nonprofit event Underground Music Showcase, saw excellence from a green team in back of the house, managing the diversion, understanding that best practices have been well established for the process of doing these events. It's not new, this practice. We have EcoCycle at the table here who have been doing these types of things for 30 years for diversion and training. And for the hauling of single stream recyclables as well as landfillable waste materials, those haulers are often the same because they can take the single stream divertible as a roll-off dumpster, as a 4 cubic yard or whatever it is, and deliver it to the MRF unit for processing. So that doesn't put a strain on the infrastructure, the systems, the haulers. The biggest question that most of us have been examining in this is the quantity of organic diversion transporters and the number of businesses that exist that are green team or event back of the house focused. And the beautiful thing is that there's like a dozen businesses in Denver operating in Denver County. So it's really about getting the events to get their vendors and everybody lined up so that the diversion is effective, because the waste diversion plan is communicated to the vendors so that the materials that they bring on site help eliminate contamination. In the spirit of the process of establishing this, you know, the event sponsors do not wish to see requirements of implementation delayed later than 2025 for some of the events, so that the standard practice is to be moving that forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. All right, we have 2 more hands raised, so I'll call on you folks. And then we will have a survey about this question as well. So I just want to make sure we leave some time for that. But I think, oh, now I only see one. Maria, why don't you go ahead? And then if anyone else had their hand up and put it down just now, feel free to put it back up.
I think I just wanted to kind of expand a little bit on my comment and to what, I'm so sorry, I see Cut the Plastic. I can't remember your name, but I see Cut the Plastic was talking about in terms of the actual implementation of what all this means, I work on a festival, and we were looking at implementing this year. So I called around to find options, but it was so far out of the budget for what we could do to make sure that there wasn't contamination. And so I do think implementation is a real key here when we consider any of these options. I'm leaning toward 4, and I'll just really speak honestly, because it is going to take a couple seasons, and I hear the urgency, and I understand it, and I think it's a great thing. But I'd really like to say, like, you know, for example, those more affordable providers who haul off this stuff, we could have set something up and done it and had somebody staff it to make sure there wasn't commingling, but then the place that would come and pick it up, it was all going to get commingled and sent to the same place. So I think, you know, that there's a lot to kind of process here and discuss, because if we're going to do all this work, and it is going to come at a cost, I mean, the cost is out there, and it's pretty expensive. So I think that's something to be considered. And I love hearing that there are going to be grants, but then of course, you know, what time is that going to be? How are you going to review that? What criteria is going to come up? There's so many considerations here. So I think that's where it's just kind of concerning to me. I'm a little concerned about, like, all this work is going to go into it, and then when it's hauled off, it's going to all go to the same place.
Yeah. And I'll make 2 points here, Maria, because I think you've brought up a really great point that people are probably considering. As Rose mentioned, there's nothing in the ordinance and nothing being considered that would penalize any particular operator for contamination. That's not part of the, you know, you're not going to get in trouble. And at the same time, I think everybody who is on this call is concerned with doing it right and doing it successfully, and to have the impact that the ballot sponsors, you know, and the public had when they voted on it, we all want to do it well. So I just want to make those 2 points equally and simultaneously. So before we hop to the poll, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, thank you all for your input. Is there anyone who we haven't heard from yet who, you know, is maybe wanting to speak up but not sure, or, you know, hasn't had a chance to express an opinion today and would like to? Randy?
Thank you. I just have a question about the conversation after this and the supporting recommendations that we could be offering beyond these 2 topics. It's been a great conversation, but one of my concerns is around monitoring of waste stations and seeing if that can be an additional requirement that maybe falls under supportive recommendations. But, you know, we talked a lot about contamination, and the goal of this ordinance is to divert waste. Well, if it's contaminated, it's not getting diverted. And so I'm just wondering, you know, we know from our many years of experience that you need to have those stations monitored. And so I'm wondering if there is an opportunity to discuss that requirement in the future.
Thanks, Randy. All right, we'll make a note of that to bring to the task force. In the meantime, if everyone would please vote. I know a lot of you probably have to hop off to get to another meeting, but please vote for the option you feel most comfortable with, and feel free to send additional feedback to wastenomore@denvergov.org. Also, please check out the website. There's a ton of information there about the recommendations. Please take the survey. And, you know, if you have some ideas later, like I said, you're always welcome to email those to wastenomore@denvergov.org. We really appreciate you all taking the time today to share all of this with us and collect more feedback.
Renee, did you have any closing thoughts? I know that your hand's been up for a little bit, and so I just wanted to give you a final word. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I kept taking my hand down because I wanted to make sure that people who, you know, aren't on the task force have an opportunity to be heard. But I'd like to offer getting a group of people together, because Brian and Christy, I know that you've got a ton of experience, but I also think that, you know, some of the large events, you know, there's challenges, and so let's have a smaller conversation, is what I wanted to offer. So I'll drop my email. I mean, I know that a lot of you know how to reach me, but I'll drop it in the chat. And if you're interested in doing that, I'd be happy to put it together. That's all I wanted to say.
And real quick, for those of you who are still with us, I know everybody is having to sign off, so I threw the poll up there. We are going to send out a post focus group survey to everyone that was on this call, also everybody on our distro list, which includes all of these different permit types. So if anybody was unable to participate in today's discussion or had to jump off before this poll, this is just a quick poll. We're still going to send out a survey. We are going to post this focus group recording up on our website, and there are continued opportunities for engagement, reaching out to us via the contact form. And Renee, if you're okay with it, or Andrea, sharing the contact information for our task force representatives so that we can make sure that people's concerns are heard and that this is part of the conversation when going back to the task force. We really appreciate everybody's time and joining us and engaging in this. It's a really big undertaking for the city, but it's going to be really positive for Denver's waste diversion moving forward. So your input in implementing this effectively so that we can do it well is really important. So since everyone's signing up, I am just going to end the poll right now. We're pretty spread out with people's sentiment on the choices. However, it does look at this time like people are most in favor of option 4. Again, we're going to go ahead and send out a survey for anyone who had to jump off early, anyone who could not participate in this, and hopefully we will get more results there. Thank you, everyone. I know it's 9:02, so I want to make sure everyone gets on to the rest of their day, and we will go ahead and end this group. Thank you all again for participating. Thank you, Erica, for facilitating. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks, everybody.